Last week we finished up with dogs, which seemed to be in some ways to be much more interesting than the laws I was talking about. This was because of the passage in Exodus 22:31. You shall be holy unto me, neither shall you eat any flesh that is torn of beasts in the field. You shall cast it to dogs. And I've done a fair bit of homework on dogs between last week and this week. I've discovered that the Assyrians, who rather enjoyed hunting lions, used to have packs of dogs which they trained for hunting purposes. But so far as Jewish society was concerned, and I've read a lot of Jewish sources, though they of course are later, the ones that exist later than the New Testament, I think one can summarize the dog situation as follows. Dogs were not encouraged, but they were tolerated, and where necessary, appreciated if they barked to warn a village of incomers, thieves. Well, that was appreciated, and there were one or two other respects. But on the whole, to talk about a dog was also to talk about, was a term of disrespect to people. To call somebody a dog was to insult them. The heathen were described as dogs, the godless as dogs, and so on. So it's quite a nice thing about dogs. So dogs were certainly around, as I say, not to be encouraged, but appreciated where necessary. Now today we come on to some laws in Deuteronomy. You're going to have to get used to my different pronunciation of this word Deuteronomy. And I have printed out a selection of laws from chapters 14 and 15, but I want to begin by reminding you of what we learned 2 weeks ago, and of reading this passage from the book by Sags in respect of the laws of Hammurabi. There is not a single case in the thousands of legal documents and reports which have been preserved in which reference is made to the wording of the text of the laws of Hammurabi. And this is clear evidence that whatever the laws were, they were not statute law to be given a verbal interpretation, but rather incorporated principles to be observed, or which actually had been observed in particular cases. We have to bear this in mind when we're thinking about what I spoke of last week, the selection of laws from Exodus 22 and 23, and what I'm going to talk about today, the selection of laws from Deuteronomy 14 and 15. We are not necessarily dealing with statute laws that were interpreted and enforced. Indeed, in the laws we're going to look at today, there is nothing about enforcement at all. It is much more preaching and exhortation than it is legislation. So we have to bear this in mind. We don't know whether in the Old Testament period these laws were actually enforced. Now, when of course we come to Orthodox Judaism, which arises several hundred years after this time, then of course the whole of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, is believed to be the revealed will of God, the written law, and of course then these laws are observed and interpreted and adapted and then expanded by the oral law. But we're not in that position when we look at these laws from Deuteronomy. Now, as I say on the handout, these laws extend from chapter 12 to the end of chapter 26. There's quite a lot of them. And they have had a complicated origin. We know, for example, that some of them are meditations, extensions on the 10 Commandments. We know that some of them were probably connected with the book of the law, which we read about in 2 Kings 22. You remember there in the year 622, the book of the law is discovered in the temple, and this is read out, and there is a great religious reformation that takes place. And in older scholarship, certainly Deuteronomy was associated with that law book that was found in the temple. Now, more recent research has indicated that the book of Deuteronomy, the laws of Deuteronomy, again have grown by a process of adaptation, expansion and so on, and we'll see a little bit of that. But our latest guess is that this collection was, or reached its final form during the exile. Now, remind you that in 597, the Babylonians captured Jerusalem and took into exile to Babylon the King Jehoiakim, and the nobles, all the skilled craftsmen. And there was put on the throne, as it were, a puppet king by the Babylonians called Zedekiah. But 10 years later, Zedekiah rebelled against the Babylonians, and so Nebuchadnezzar marched against Jerusalem. And this time, 587, the temple was destroyed, the city was destroyed, and then there was another brief exiling of people in the year 582. So there begins this period that we call, rightly or wrongly, the exile. Now, we mustn't imagine that the land is totally denuded of inhabitants. Clearly, the main administrators, the king, the nobility, they have been taken away. And what is left is therefore a society, we might think lucky society, from which has been removed all the bosses, all the managers. But the society has got, as it were, to pull together, has got to survive. And so far as we can guess from archaeology, and this is an examination of things that indicate a centralized state in the ancient world, that is public buildings, luxury items and things like that, where you have lots of these, that this shows a centralized state working. In this so-called exilic period, we've got a complete lack of evidence of luxury items, writing things, public buildings being maintained and so on. And so we assume that we've got a period of austerity, a period where people have got to pull together in the very difficult circumstances that have been created by the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the exiling of the notable and ruling people. And it seems as though the laws in their present form, therefore, are an attempt to advise, to encourage a community which is experiencing hardship and poverty and which needs to pull together. And we have to remember that we're talking about an agriculturally subsistent society, a society in which you're only going to get food if you grow it yourself. You're only going to get wine if you produce it. And so on and so forth. So this is what we're talking about. And I start off on the handout with the passage from the end of chapter 14 of Deuteronomy. At the end of 3 years thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year, and shall lay it up within thy gates, and the Levite, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates, shall come, and shall eat and be satisfied, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hand which thou doest. Now, tithes in the ancient world, of course, were a form of taxation. Tithes were things paid to the king. Tithes were things paid to the temple to keep these institutions going. And the interesting thing about this tithe is that it's not to be paid to the temple or to the king, but it is to be used for social reasons, to support those people most vulnerable in the society. Now, let me say something about the 3 years. We tend to think of stretches of time in terms of tens, don't we? We talk about the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. We think of decades. In ancient Israel, they think in terms of periods of 7 years. Of course, stretches of time of 7 days. And we'll come on to 7 years in a moment. What is happening here is that every third year, so in year 3 and year 6 of a 7-year cycle, there is this special tithe, And the purpose of the tithe, as I say, is not to give it to the king or the temple, but actually to share it with those people in this subsistence and hard-pressed society who are most vulnerable. We start off with the Levite. The Levite is some kind of religious official. He may be a priest. And one of the effects, of course, not only of Josiah's reforms, but then of the Babylonian activity and the destruction of the temple, is that there were a lot of out-of-work priests and cultic officials. And how were they to be maintained? I mean, normally, when society was functioning properly, these Levites at their local sanctuaries were supported by the tithes and gifts brought to the local sanctuaries. But that doesn't operate any longer. So we have the Levite, we have the stranger. And I've mentioned the stranger before. The stranger is the Israelite or non-Israelite who is being given shelter, refuge, asylum by a family. Someone estranged from his, or possibly her, family and kin, therefore without other social means of support. In other words, extremely vulnerable. And I think I said last week that in our own society, the homeless, the people on the streets, would be in this sort of category. The fatherless and the widow, these are the archetypal vulnerable people. And so these people which are within thy gates, that is within your settlement, shall come and eat and be satisfied. Why? So that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hand which thou doest. And then as we move into chapter 15, we come to the verse that was the driving passage behind the Jubilee campaign as we came up to the year 2000. And many of you may remember that, a campaign in order to try to get the rich nations to cancel the debts of the third world nations. And this was wrongly called Jubilee because in Leviticus chapter 25, and we may look at that a little bit next week, there is the so-called Jubilee year, the 49th or the 50th year, in which, among other things, all properties are to be returned to their original owners. But the Jubilee year doesn't say anything about the remission of debts or loans. And so it was a combination of Leviticus 25 and this Deuteronomy 15 that gave the impetus to the so-called Jubilee campaign to get rich nations to cancel the debts of poor nations. And even then, of course, this is really very different, because this is talking about something that should happen every 7 years, not just because we've got something coming up to a millennium, as would happen in the year 2000. Though we mustn't complain about that. I mean, better that this should have happened in the way that it did in the year 2000 than not happen at all. So at the end of every 7 years, thou shalt make a release. And this is the manner of release. And then we get some quite awkward Hebrew, which I have given you literally in bold type. Every possessor of a loan of his hand shall let drop that which he lendeth to his neighbour, which the authorized version, which I've got here so that we can see the second person singular being used, brings out, every creditor that lendeth ought unto his neighbour shall release it. And he goes on, he shall not exact it of his neighbour or of his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. Now just a little bit again about these words, or of his brother. Because when we look at the Hebrew, we can see that what has happened is that originally neighbour was there, and it was then more clearly defined by the word brother. But in these chapters in Deuteronomy, the word brother has taken a very distinctive meaning. Brother here does not mean someone related to you by blood. Brother means any other Israelite. There is what we call a brother ethic operating in these chapters of Deuteronomy. Any fellow Israelite is a brother and is thought of in this way. The idea of the family, the obligations of the family, are extended to include the whole people. Now, what we don't know, and the experts disagree here, is whether they're talking about a total waiving of the loan, and I'll talk in a minute about the loan, or whether it means putting off calling in the loan when it's due, just for 1 year. Now, let's remember what we're thinking about here. We're not talking about a loan of money. Money in the form of coins does not exist at this time. Money is pieces of silver or pieces of other metal that may be judged to be precious. And this is weighed by, according to certain conventions. A bushel of wheat may therefore, according to the convention, be weighed against so many silver pieces. This is how it works. And so the loan here is much more likely not in terms of bits of precious metal, but in terms of corn, wine, sheep, cattle, that sort of thing. What will enable people in this subsistence agricultural society to be able to eat and survive. So these loans would have been made, and they would have been recorded in some way. 2 weeks ago, when I was talking about the origin of writing and so on, I brought a book with me. One or two of you may have looked at it, with some of the earliest forms of writing that we have, going back to over 3000 BC, which are sort of IOUs for sheep, where you've got a sort of rough drawing of a sheep or an animal, and then some little dots to indicate how many. These are the earliest written records that we have, so going back a very long way, say little IOUs for things that have been lent. And so in some way, there would have been, though written on perishable material, otherwise we would have survived them. I mean, you see, in ancient Palestine, you don't have a great abundance of clay, and we don't have clay tablets. People write on other things, wood, pots, skins, and things that don't. Pots, of course, survive quite nicely, but skins and wood not so much, unless they're specially preserved. So loans have been made of sheep, wine, oil, or whatever, and these have been recorded in some sort of way. And so the question is, what does it mean here? Does it mean that every 7th year all these loans are extinguished, so that if I've lent 2 sheep to somebody, when the 7th year comes along, I can't ask for those back, that loan is extinguished? Or does it mean that in the 7th year I don't ask for those back, but I could do a year later? Now, there are arguments on both sides that we will have a look at it as we go on. Now the next bit, which is of a foreigner, thou mayest exact it again, but that which is thine with thy brother, thine hand shall release. Well, we might think that this is a bit hard on the foreigner. One can't imagine actually there were very many foreigners around in the land in this situation. But I suppose what it's emphasizing is the cohesiveness that is necessary for the community. If this excludes some people, that's a shame. But we have to remember that the Israelites may already be accommodating non-Israelites who have the status of stranger and who are being given the hospitality due to a stranger. Now when we get to verse 4, save when there shall be no poor among you. This is a difficult verse to translate, and some people think it means that there ought to be no poor among you, because you're acting in this way. If you carry this out, there won't be any poor, because they will be supported. Or perhaps there is some ideal being expressed here. He goes on to say, I think with great hope, the Lord shall greatly bless thee in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance, possess it, and then so on. Verse 7, if there be among you a poor man of one of thy brethren within thy gates in thy land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, Thou shalt not harden thine heart, nor shut thine hand from thy poor brother, but shall open thine hand wide unto him, and shalt surely lend him sufficient for his need in that which he wanteth. Again, we're not talking about coins or money, we're talking about produce and such things. Beware that there be not a thought in thy wicked heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of release, is at hand, and thine eye be evil against thy poor brother, and thou givest him naught, and he cry unto the Lord against thee, and it be sin unto thee. Now, obviously, from the practical point of view, if there is this law, that when the 7th year comes, you can't get your loans back. If we're in year 6 and somebody wants a loan from you, are you going to give it to him? Since you know that there's no possibility of return, you know that it's not going to come back. And so this is almost sort of self-defeating, isn't it, this particular law? And so this is one reason why some people argue, okay, it's not the total remission of the debt, it's only putting off the payment of the debt for that year. I don't think that's a strong argument. I go for the view that it's the complete remission of the debt that's being spoken of. And it's interesting that in New Testament times, there is a famous teacher, slightly older than Jesus, called Hillel, a very famous Jewish teacher. And he introduced something called a prosbull, which was a legal document which would be signed by two parties if one was making a loan to the other, in which it was agreed that the rules of the Sabbath year here would not apply. And although this may seem to us to be rather trying to get around the law, it was a practical thing to ensure that the loans were made. Otherwise people wouldn't make loans at all if they knew for certain that when year 7 comes they weren't going to get anything back. So we see some of the hazards of trying to encourage these things to happen. So verse 10, thou shalt surely give him, and thine heart shall not be grieved when thou givest unto him, because that this thing the Lord thy God shall bless thee in all thy works, and in all that thou puttest thine hand unto. For the poor shall never cease out of the land. Therefore I command thee, saying, thou shalt open thine hand wide unto thy brother, to thy poor, to thy needy in thy land. Now, the next group of laws, and this is quite interesting, have to do with slavery. And it's important here to say a word about slavery. I can't remember whether it was here or somewhere else we were discussing together about the way in which the Bible had been used, of course, to justify slavery. But we have to remember that the sort of slavery that the Bible was being used to justify was a very different sort of slavery from what we're talking about here. It's one thing, to take your boat off to the shores of Africa, by force of arms to round up some men and women, to transport them across, to the West Indies, and then condemn them and their families to grow up as perpetually enslaved. That is an extremely bad thing, but it is very different from what the Old Testament is talking about when it talks about slavery. Why should people be slaves? Why should this situation be tolerated? And slavery came about when people fell into debt and could not redeem themselves. Now, that of course sounds contradictory, doesn't it, to what we have just been reading about, because if the Israelites are going to be doing what they're told here, lending to anybody who is in need, that is making sure that they've got enough to eat, enough to drink, enough for the family to survive, you wouldn't need people to be becoming slaves and so on. But we don't live in an ideal world, and so although the law may seem contradictory, it is realistic. It could come about that for all sorts of reasons people might not be able to sustain themselves. You get a bad harvest, and some people have got better storage facilities than others, or you may get some pestilence that wipes out some things and not others, or illness or injury. stops the people who produce the food in the family from doing it, and all sorts of reasons why in ancient Israel people can fall into this situation where they cannot produce the food that they need to survive, and they have to borrow from other people, and then if the payment back is needed, eventually they become so indebted that they have to sell their land. This is what the Jubilee is about from next week. And then finally themselves. People who come into slavery do it of necessity. And what the Old Testament is insistent on is that if this happens, this is not a permanent slavery. This is limited slavery. And it mustn't go on. And in a minute we shall see a very generous, I call it law here, but a generous precept that is being advocated. But what is so interesting here is the fact that if we compare these laws about slavery with the ones that come in the book of Exodus, we see that women are treated entirely differently. In the laws in Exodus, it is only the man who is released at the end of 6 years unless he voluntarily wants to go on being a slave, and then there's a ceremony that signifies that. But the woman is not released. And the only circumstances in the laws in Exodus 21 in which a woman can be released from slavery is if she marries into the family of her master. If she marries, for example, the master's son, she then ceases to be a slave and she becomes a member of the family. She becomes free through marriage. So you have the situation envisaged in Exodus where a man can come with his family into slavery, and only he can be released at the end of 6 years, but his wife and children not. Here, the law has been extended. And the interesting thing is, if you read from 12 down to 12 down to 18, you will see that this is all framed in terms simply of the man. If thy brother and Hebrew man, or Hebrew woman, be sold unto thee and serve thee 6 years, then in the 7th year thou shalt let him, not them, go free. When thou sendest him out free, and so on and so forth. And the ceremony in verse 17 is for him. Verse 18, it shall not seem hard unto thee when thou sendest him away. The first draft of this law was all just in terms of a male slave. And then we have these two nice additions, which shows you the way in which laws are extended and their provisions are enlarged. So, if thy brother, an Hebrew man, or a Hebrew woman, and in verse 17, and also unto thy maidservant thou shalt do likewise. So we can see the law actually growing and extending its scope and deepening its sympathy. But now we come on to the really interesting thing in verses 13 and 14. When thou sendest him out free, thou shalt not let him go away empty, thou shalt furnish him liberally. The Hebrew word here translated is a lovely word. It means bejewel. It's the word for jewel, that precious stone, and it's a verb. Thou shalt bejewel him. In other words, you must sort of endow him liberally. I think furnish liberally is a nice translation of a literal Hebrew word that means bejewel. Thou shalt furnish him liberally, out of thy flock, out of thy floor, that means the threshing floor, out of thy winepress. Of that wherewith the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, thou shalt give unto him. Now what is interesting here is that this is not legislation, because if it were, it would probably say you must give him 2 sheep, and a bushel of wheat, and so many jars of wine. No. The appeal is to the generosity of the servant, of the master who is letting the servant go free. Thou shalt furnish him liberally, out of thy flock, out of thy floor, out of thy winepress. Of that wherewith the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, thou shalt give unto him. And thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondman in the land of Egypt, and the Lord thy God redeemed thee. Therefore I command thee this thing today. Again and again in Deuteronomy we have an appeal to what I call this imperative of redemption, the reminder to the Israelites that their existence as free people in a land of their own, even under the straitened circumstances that I described earlier on in the talk, they owe that status entirely to the grace and the mercy of God, and that grace and mercy is to be actualized in what I call structures of grace. Ways of so organizing society that graciousness is exhibited, and so that people can feel affirmed and accepted. And all the things that have gone on in this chapter so far have been to that end. The command that people should have things given to them if they are in need, that there should be some limitation on calling in these loans according to periods of year. And now, it's not therefore just a matter of letting people go free. What is a slave to do? I mean, it's the problem we have when people come out of prison. I mean, I'm sure Nick may have found this as well, but I mean, when you're walking around in a dog collar and you're stopped by people asking for money, certainly it hasn't happened to me recently, but certainly in the old days, one of the stories that was told was that of someone having just come out of prison and wanting some money to get to somewhere. I don't know what happens now when people are released from prison, what sort of money they're given, what sort of support they're given. I mean, let's hope it's decent. But you see the point. You come out of prison. Where are you going to go? What are you going to live on? And this is a problem for somebody released from slavery, because that person has become a slave because of the hardship that there was in working the land, producing whatever it is. And so the master has got to furnish the released slave liberally, and it is left to him an appeal to his generosity, an appeal to his understanding of God, the implication being that the greater he feels gratitude to God, the greater he will or should give to the freed bondman. Verse 16, it shall be, if he say unto thee, I will not go away from thee, because he loveth thee and thine house, because he is well with thee, thou shalt take an awl, and thrust it through his ear unto the door, and he shall be thy servant forever. It has to be done in a publicly attested ceremony that this person is voluntarily relinquishing his freedom. So that slavery, when spoken of in the Bible, is very different from the sort of slavery that people disgustingly used the Bible to support in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. And one has to remember that the best biblical commentators certainly didn't use the Bible to support slavery. One of my great heroes is the Puritan commentator Richard Baxter from the second part of the 17th century, who wrote a massive tome called the Christian Directory. It runs to 800 closely printed pages. And with regard to slavery, he says quite clearly that the only people who deserve to lose their freedom are criminals, those who have shown that they cannot live responsibly in society. And he strongly condemns any sort of slavery that involves depriving people of their freedom, and he's quite clear that there is no warrant at all in the Bible for any of that. And it's curious, isn't it, that the people who use the Bible in support of slavery seem to have overlooked the fact that if they were going to take the Bible literally, it said you've got to release slaves after 6 years. And you've got to furnish them liberally. I wonder to what extent Christian slave owners took that. I mean, I don't know. I'd love to have time to study it, and perhaps in the discussion afterwards somebody will know whether American or West Indian slave owners took seriously the biblical injunction about letting people go after 6 years. And the bottom verse, it shall not seem hard unto thee when thou sendest him away free from thee, for he hath been worth a double hired servant unto thee in serving these 6 years. You've got to remember, you've had his service, and probably that of his family as well. And I think the inclusion, incidentally, of the woman here is going to mean letting the man go free with his wife, rather than though I suppose it might have been, I mean, fathers did have the power to sell their daughters into slavery. Perhaps the idea was that they could be released, and the 6 years would apply to them also. So what we've seen then, just in this fragment of looking at instructions from Deuteronomy, is that there is a tremendous social cohesion, social compassion working here, grounded in the love and mercy of God. This is humanitarian, but it is humanitarian based upon an apprehension of God's mercy. And as we shall see next week, when we come to look at a little bit of Leviticus, I mean, there is this conviction there that God did not redeem his people from slavery so that they could enslave each other. And one of the great things about the broad churchmen of the 19th century, I'm thinking people like Charles Kingsley, F.D. Morris and so on, was that they also had this tremendously deep sense of the whole human race as created by God, dependent upon the grace of God. And what fueled their great attempts, I mean, you think of the writer Charles Kingsley, The Water Babies, what fueled their involvement with the beginnings of Christian socialism was essentially this view that if we are all the children of God, created in his image, then we should treat each other in that way. These are God's people and deserve so to be treated. And there's a marvelous passage in Kingsley where Kingsley says, why do we baptize children and then let them be subjected to the workhouse and poverty and all the other dreadful things that could come upon you if you were an orphan and a vulnerable person in Victorian society? It was a vision, I think, inspired by what we have here in the Old Testament. It is a vision that we could do well to learn and apply to our own work.